Morning, everyone. So I thought we'd talk about one of the more remarkable witness statements that I've read so far. So for those who don't know, obviously, I'm sure you all know there's a COVID inquiry going on and there's like evidence. And we're in the module at the moment where they're sort of discussing decision making at the top level. In fact, according to the lady behind me, Helen McNamara, the only decision making was at the top level. One of the things she's described is how we had this wonderful structure around the country in the NHS that the government didn't want to use. So, I mean, one of the more revealing things. So, you know, we observed exactly what the government were doing in 2020 and scratching our heads and thinking why, or, you know, what's the angle? And she's sort of describing various attitudes. And one of the attitudes she describes is how, you know, the government and Boris Johnson, obviously specifically, were always thinking in terms of thinking, right, we have this structure in place. How can we improve it to make, you know, to get the best outcomes in the pandemic? It was always, oh no, this is bad. This can't do the job. We need to build something else from scratch. So when we talk about things like test and trace, you know, they've got NHS track and trace, which had nothing to do with the NHS. We did have an NHS tracking system in place, which was working. Then Boris Johnson completely stopped it because he thought we should just let the virus run through the population. And then he was persuaded, actually, that's not the greatest idea he's ever had. Not that he ever has great ideas. It's, you know, so, and we go to this £37 billion budget thing and we think, oh, well, this is just a way of like funneling a load of public money into private hands. And yeah, absolutely, it's done that. But then she's sort of suggesting there was a sort of more deep-rooted ideological belief that if it's like, okay, we need to do a thing, does the existing structure allow us to do it? No. So instead of thinking, so how do we make it better so it can? It's like, let's start from scratch and build something completely new, which of course completely failed. But the main one I wanted to go over today was specifically, because there's so many things coming out of this, specifically about the lack of diversity which hit anyone who was outside of that sort of social bubble very hard. But in this particular case, women who are basically half of the country. And McNamara's evidence, her witness statement, obviously she gave evidence as well in terms of answering questions, but her witness statement, I've put a link in the description below if you want to read it yourself. I want to go through some of the aspects specifically to do with women, because, like I say, that is literally half the population. I was saying myself, you know, to someone, if Labour were to, you know, run any investigations directly as a result of this, yeah, they won't need to do a lot of it because this COVID inquiry will do a lot of it for them. But I think Labour coming into power could do a lot worse than to order an inquiry, not a public inquiry, because they're going to have that for HS2. You don't run public inquiries like by the bucket load, but have a serious investigation into how decision making is clearly failing women, which is half the population. We know it is. And it's not just related to COVID. My worry is that a lot of this evidence it'll look like, oh, within the confines of COVID, because the way it can look is you just had men in charge, right? You had Boris Johnson in charge, you had Dominic Cummings, you had Michael Gove in charge of the Cabinet Office, you had Lee Kane as Director of Communications, the Chief Medical Officer and the Chief Scientific Officers were both men. And the fact that Boris, because we know from Dominic Cummings's evidence earlier this week, he wanted to control all sources of information going to Boris Johnson. And of course, he's a man. It massively reduced the number of people who were taking part in that top level decision making. She says McNamara says in her evidence, even the cabinet weren't involved in decision making. So the government wasn't actually involved in this. They weren't having discussions. The only member of the cabinet the members of the cabinet who really had many discussions were Rishi Sunak as the Chancellor, Michael Gove heading up the Cabinet Office, and Matt Hancock as the Health Secretary. You know, as far as I can tell from the evidence, that was pretty much it. There were no real cabinet meetings to discuss a lot of these things. So the discussion, you know, and Rishi Sunak and Matt Hancock are also men. So all of this led to top level discussions about how to manage it purely with men, and not just men in general, ones who only ever think in terms of their own social circumstances. She says in her witness statement about some of the things clearly disproportionately affecting people from Black and Asian communities, and she said the response to that was, well, that's just one of those things. Nothing we can do about it. It's just a natural phenomenon. It's like as opposed to deliberate decision making, albeit inadvertent. And when she brings up the issue that there's no real diversity of thought in the decision making, they say, oh no, you're quite wrong. The Home Secretary and the Chancellor are not white. Referring to Priti Patel and Rishi Sunak at the time. And she's making clear in her witness statement, it's like they don't get it, do they? They're not diverse because they came from pretty much the same backgrounds. So they don't have that diversity of thought that allows them to think how ordinary people, they don't live how ordinary people live. And they've never lived how ordinary people live. But let's just go through a few of the things she said specifically on the way that women were not really thought of at all. First of all, she also said, really, really important to note this about the women working in Downing Street. She said when she went away for a bit and she came back, and she said that everyone kept saying to her how great it was that there was a woman going to be involved again, because she was quite a senior civil servant in the Cabinet Office. And she lays it on quite thick here that there were so many people who were just women working in Downing Street who felt that they were just being completely ignored. And she says that the atmosphere in Whitehall and Westminster has always been sexist, but it just became so much more obviously so during COVID. And I think the implication from her is the reason for that is because they completely centralised the decision making. Like when things are running normally, you've got lots of decision making spread across the whole civil service and government and so on, whereas it was all condensed down into those top few people who were Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, Matt Hancock, Rishi Sunak, Dominic Cummings, Lee Kane, Martin Reynolds, these sort of people, all men from privately educated backgrounds. Actually, I don't know about Matt Hancock, but it wouldn't surprise me. Graham will be onto it. I'll go through a few comments before I go through literally what some of the things she said. Hang on, I'm trying to find something down here. The only decisions were red or white wine at the party. I don't think they even made those decisions because they just all went in a suitcase and just grabbed what you want, didn't you? Best phrase of a draft report, superhero bun fights. Basically, they parachuted in 24 people who all thought they were going to save the country and promptly ignored everyone else's ideas. Yeah, she does refer to this sort of hero mentality. I mean, she says it's not just that women were excluded from it. There were quieter men as well. They had this attitude that they were, like you say. I mean, Boris Johnson in his speech when he talked about how we're not going to shut the economy down, we're going to get through it, we're going to show the world. He described the UK as being like a Clark Kent needing to turn into a Superman. It was all this big macho bollocks, wasn't it? But in terms of what she says here, she says, going on from the sort of obvious misogyny within Downing Street, she says, in terms of the policy response, the exclusion of a female perspective led to significant negative consequences, including the lack of thought given to childcare in the context of school closures. Obviously, people like Boris Johnson don't even care for his own kids directly or indirectly. So there was a serious lack of thinking about domestic abuse and the vulnerable, about carers and informal networks for how people look after each other in families and communities. All of these things which are not part of the everyday life of someone from a wealthy, privileged background. It's just not part of their life, right? There was not enough thinking about the impact on single parents of some of the restrictions. There was a disproportionate amount of attention given to more male pursuits in terms of the impact of restrictions and the lessening of the same. So the emphasis on, as they reduce the restrictions on being able to play football, hunting, shooting, fishing. Again, all the things that, that team would be thinking about. There was a lack of guidance for women who might be pregnant or who were pregnant, and what those who were key workers should do, particularly significant in education in the NHS, given the demographics of their workforce, in other words, mostly women. The restrictions around birth and pregnancy care seemed unnecessarily restrictive and were comparatively slow to adapt. She says, I never understood this. Although I appreciated the need to keep hospitals as secure as possible, there would have been kinder ways of managing pregnancy and birth, especially given the differential clinical outcomes for women and their babies who become stressed. She did actually say a bit later that she thought that maybe they could have used the Nightingale hospitals as pregnancy and maternity care units if you wanted to keep them separate from the hospitals. She did actually say about the Nightingale hospitals as well, is during the because we now know the Nightingale hospital is very well set up, but then not staffed. And the way I described it at the time is it was clear, for me, it was clearly an attempt to show that the NHS was fine, because it's like, we've created all this extra capacity and it's not being used, because the Nightingale hospitals were barely used and it's not being used, therefore there's no need for the use, therefore the NHS is fine. But that was untrue. The reason the Nightingale hospitals weren't really used is because there was no staff for them. It's all right putting beds in there. You can't just dump an ill person in a bed. They need care. It's the nurses who care for them. And in fact, someone was saying, Fraser Nelson, who's of The Spectator, was saying yesterday about how at the time, it says, there was like these 4,000 NHS beds that were completely unused. Therefore, the NHS wasn't struggling at all. And the Larry the Cat Twitter account of all people had to respond to him to say, beds don't care for people. If it did, it'd be like John Lewis leading the charge. Because that's the important. It doesn't matter how many beds you've got, how much staff have you got to staff those beds. Because remember, especially in 2020, you had a load of frontline NHS staff becoming ill. Of course you did. They didn't get any PPE. Anyway, sorry, carrying on. In fact, she's actually just said this next bit. I've gone ahead. It says, there's been a better use of Nightingale hospitals to put all maternity care outside the mainstream hospitals. Most strikingly in the early days, in terms of specific policy that only impacted on women, there was an attempt to tacitly restrict access to abortion by not making provision available outside of clinics, and the clinics were closed. She's also said there was a failure to appreciate some of the longer-standing institutional biases against women, example in how data was collected. That was particularly significant given the value put on the data in understanding decision-making. So what she was saying is, so she said in part of her witness statement, like, for example, it comes to the extra, it should be obvious during a lockdown that there's going to be a heightened risk of domestic violence. Absolutely obvious. Yet she's describing the fact that the decision makers didn't think it was a priority. And why? Because it's like, well, we don't have any data. Well, we don't have any data on it. It's like, of course you're not. You've just gone into lockdown. It's happening. We know there'll be increased instances. We're not going to have any data, are we, you idiots? And that was her, the whole thing. Also about PPE, it says here, so she raised the issue that some of the PPE wasn't necessarily brilliant for women. And she raised this, and it says, the Prime Minister raised this with Simon Stevens on April the 30th, and he reassured the Prime Minister and ministers that the issues with PPE fitting women's bodies were misreported and there was not a problem. I mean, on April the 30th, there was a problem in that we didn't actually have enough PPE in the first place. So that would be a nonsense. And she says here, I do not know if the culture was always more sexist than we'd noticed and just more obvious under pressure. One Angry Pagan, £5 super chat, thank you very much. It says, could this be part of the reason for the inordinate response to Sarah Everard's vigil? No, because, so in terms of that Met Police response, there are two major figures who have political oversight over the Met Police. One is the Mayor of London, so Sadiq Khan. He was absolutely outraged. In fact, he had spoken to the Met Police Commissioner, who was still Cressida Dick at the time, wasn't it? And he said to her that he wanted to make sure that they dealt with it properly. He'd specifically said to them, you don't go in mob-handed, right? So then think about the other leaders in charge of the Met at the time. So Priti Patel as Home Secretary, well, she's a woman, and Cressida Dick, the Met Commissioner, she's a woman, right? So the response to that vigil was ultimately determined by women. So I don't think that was an issue there. It was just the fact those decisions were being made by cretins. And quite why, I still couldn't tell you. I really have no idea. Again, I can easily fall into the trap of saying, look, if Labour come into power, they should be ordering loads of investigations of so many things. And you can't, of course, because they've got the job of, they can't be telling the civil service to run all these investigations because there'll be nothing, they've got stuff to get done, right? They need stuff doing, and the civil service will be like every other public service, understaffed when they come into power. So you can't run into everything. But if I would just suggest a few things, they're doing the HS2 public inquiry. That's brilliant. That's great. Other little investigations. I think, when it comes to the Met, you've got to, I would just scrap it and start again with that thing. I've said enough times. But if you're going to say to yourself, well, we'll try and reform it. Okay. Well, let's work on a bit at a time. And you could at least launch a small investigation into what was the sequence of events that led to that disproportionate handling of that vigil? Because that would tell, given that one of the most serious problems in the Met Police is misogyny, that would give you, and again, that's something that literally affects half the population of London as well as the UK. That might get the ball rolling on some serious reform. So you could certainly do that. Oh, Brian's talking about a bit of damage over the winds. Yes, my sympathies with those in the north of France and the south of England, and potentially parts of Wales getting absolutely battered. We're getting away with it where I am, in the North Midlands. Thatcher taught me a good lesson about the Tories. Well, I knew nothing about the Tories, and I was like the child of Thatcher, really. So Margaret Thatcher was already Prime Minister when I became politically aware. And of course, I grew up in a mining village. There was very little chance of me being pro-conservative, I suppose, even growing up in a conservative family. But there we go. Oh, you saw Thatcher on the day she came to power outside number 10. Yeah, see, I would have been like 3. It would have been round about my 3rd birthday. So absolutely did nothing. But yes, some of this stuff in here, it's absolutely incredible. Again, she's saying here, just because not all of these things were just rampant misogyny. Some of it was just because, one of the things I say about MPs, a lot of MPs, for example, have a degree in what's called PPE from Oxford, which, covers politics, economics, and so on. And it sounds like a really good course if you want to go into politics. But my issue with it is, because a lot of the things you'll be learning are not fact, they're, economics is not a science. So it's not like, I'm not sure how I would describe it. I'd describe it as more science than humanities in a way. But you can't really prove a thing. It's not like, okay, so this economic model really fits, because it the cultural attitudes in a society can determine to a large extent whether or not a particular economic model will work or not, or better than another. So economics keeps changing, economic ideas keep changing and need to be revised. And my worry is, and the same with political ideas and political realities, like still people right now, clever people who've proven themselves in politics, keep saying Starmer needs to do this, Starmer needs to do that, because this is what we needed to do in 97. It's like, yeah, but it's not 97, is it? It's different. You've even got Alistair Campbell, who obviously knows his stuff, and he keeps saying, oh, but Starmer to win needs to do this. It's like, mate, Starmer's winning, doing the opposite of what you're suggesting. So times change. And my worry is when you've got people doing a particular the same degree, where you're learning a load of ideas that are not fixed, but they think they are. It creates this groupthink, because each individual person who's got that degree thinks they know more than others about politics and economics, right? And then they're discussing with other people, they're deciding laws with other people who've got the same degree, and they all agree with each other. There's never any thought. And so an outsider comes in and says, well, hang on, you might be wrong there. They say, what do you know? You haven't got this PPE degree. And it's the same thing here. Even without like the deliberate bigotry, You've got a group of people who all come from the same background. They were chosen because they came from the same background. Brexit filtered a lot of this in. It filtered in a lot of people of the same mindset. So someone from an outside of that bubble says something that contradicts them. It's like, well, no, you're being ridiculous. So they don't even think about it, don't consider it. Inquiry shows that Labour Social Fund have been correct in their analysis for years. Lots of people knew what was going on. We don't know that. I mean, some of the things that's coming out is news to us, obviously. And I'm a little surprised at that. I said at the start of the COVID inquiry that I thought, what I expected to find out I thought there'd be some genuine revelations, right? I did think there'd be some genuine revelations. But I thought largely what we would see is just more concrete evidence for what we already knew was happening. And what I would say is I think there's been more revelations than I expected. But ultimately, yeah, there were lots of people who were paying attention with a critical eye in 2020 who could see, we could see the lies of it because it was an absolute nonsense. You know, the idea of following the science. Okay, I have a science degree, right? But even people who don't, you just had to be paying attention. It was very obvious because someone who just does GCSE level science, that sort of, compulsory education level science, wherever you are in the world, would see that they clearly were not following the science. It was obvious. It was obvious that they were ignoring expert advice. I mean, just take the nature of the disease. Boris Johnson putting all that emphasis on washing your hands. And you're going, it's clearly a respiratory disease. It's clearly a respiratory disease. We know that. It's like, I remember even the very, very early days, there was an article on the BBC explaining, because the problem was, and the BBC actually did, for all its faults, did better than the government at trying to get some basic points across. Like, there's too many people, even now, just think, don't be in the same room as someone with COVID. But it's like, no, don't be in the same room as within a few hours of someone who's had COVID. And they showed this thing on the BBC about someone just walking down a supermarket aisle. They don't have to even be coughing or anything, although that makes it worse. And, going into the air. And you could follow them an hour later and you still can be infected. And they showed simulations of this, and we had this all out. So it was very obvious from the start. We all knew it was respiratory. We knew it was going to be passed. Like, the government kept trying to say things like, oh, we don't know, it can be passed asymptomatically. No, we knew that from the start. We knew that the reason COVID spread so quickly was because some people were catching it and not developing symptoms for several days. And, you can get across the world really quickly these days with modern transport. We knew it was passed asymptomatically. We knew it was a respiratory disease. We knew all these things, and yet the government were behaving as if we didn't know these things, and in fact that these things weren't even likely. They were conducting policy according to that. So it was bloody obvious that they were lying. It was clearly obvious that they were lying. What has genuinely surprised me is just how ignorant the people in the decision-making process were. Because I just thought, I know Boris Johnson's not really good at science. I get that. But I didn't actually think he was as thick as he really is. I mean, my video on my own channel today, the first video, is effectively about Boris Johnson's stupidity. Because I'm sick of people saying to me, even critics of Boris Johnson, oh, he's not actually thick, Phil. He's okay. The way his brain works is not helpful, but he's not actually a stupid man. Yes, he is a stupid man. He's an idiot. And if nothing else proves it, I'll tell you what does, and we all know what's happened to what came out yesterday. The hairdryer, right? Boris Johnson watched a clip on YouTube saying you could cure COVID with a hairdryer, right? Up your nose. And what he did is he asked his top scientists, can you cure COVID with a hairdryer? Now, you may think I'm just saying, well, he's been stupid for thinking you can cure COVID with a hairdryer. No, it's stupider than that, right? Because a clever man who has no idea about science, like, let's say You were clever, but so ignorant of science, you think someone told you, if a scientific expert told you, oh yeah, if you just blast hot air up your nose, that'll deal with it. Okay, you believe that. So you don't know, right? Okay, that's fine. Why doesn't he think that, what, like, imagine the scenario in his head. He's going to ask this question, right? If the scientific advisors said, oh yeah, you can, why wouldn't they have already told him before? Why wouldn't all the top scientists in the world be saying, what we need to do is get hairdryers and we can solve this thing overnight? Or even if it only works on some people, why wasn't it already new? Why weren't the top scientists of the world already saying, try a hairdryer, it might work on you. Do it, you know, twice a day, just without, you don't even have COVID, do it twice a day, just precautionary. It helps. That was not advice coming from any country in the world. Boris Johnson's seen it on a YouTube video. So to even ask the question without knowing anything about science, without knowing whether or not it could work, he should have known it couldn't possibly work, because if it could, scientists would already have been advising it. That's how stupid he is. That's like Nadine Dorries level thick. Boris Johnson is not clever. I will not accept anyone trying to tell me that he's just clever, but because he's a narcissist, his brain's not useful. No, he's not. He's an idiot. He's always been an idiot. Oh, he got his degree from Oxford, where he didn't have to pass any exams. The specific degree Boris Johnson did had no exams. You were just, your tutor just went, yeah, you're all right. That was it. That's the degree he did. Hasn't passed anything in his life. He's never achieved any sort of intellectual, he's never met any intellectual test in his entire life. He went to Eton, where you just pay for an education. Then he went to Oxford and did the degree, where again you just get your education. One angry pagan there, another £5 super chat, thank you. It says, I got more useful information from science journals on Google Docs than from the government. Whilst I've caught a couple of illness, I still haven't had COVID. Yes, I unfortunately did last month. It is deeply unpleasant. And my partner's now ill at the moment. We're hoping not COVID. She doesn't think it is. She's been ill for a few days now, and it's not like developed into really bad. But the COVID test, we'd run out, so they're on the way. They're arriving today. So, I mean, one thing I learned was air filters are really good. So the air filters are all over the house at the moment, on full blast. So what we're going to do is, because there's people in this household who have had COVID and I've got away with it, again, because you're using the air filters, the HEPA filters. But it's like, you know, we could have learnt so much more. Like, we know, for example, when we went through that brief period of wearing masks, other illnesses, other respiratory illnesses went down. Other airborne illnesses went down. Of course they did, because people who were ill, well, actually everyone, but people who were ill especially were wearing masks. So why didn't we go, oh, this works to deal with a lot of other illnesses as well. So why don't we develop a culture whereby if you're ill with something, even just a cold, you wear a mask? You know, not like when you go out or, you know, like when you go to work or shops or something like that. Why don't we just make it a cultural thing where we wear a mask when we're ill? Because then you cut down on other illnesses which can kill people. Questionable absurdity. I had a long think about the hairdryer thing and worked out that if everyone wore a hairdryer on their mouth so the exhaled air got heated to 60 plus degrees, might have some effect, but I'm crazy. Yes, you are actually crazy. Is she still a civil servant? Yeah, as far as I know. Didn't their continuous law breaking have any consequences, re employment? Would they have to sack everyone? She, I think, was she the one? Someone yesterday said, it may have been her, I think it was her, who said she doesn't think that there was a single day where Downing Street weren't breaking the law. You know, she says that with some of the things, they sort of realised in hindsight that they didn't really understand the law very well. I can only accept that argument on the basis that if they weren't discussing themselves how they need to comply with the law properly, okay. But I would say I felt I understood the law well enough. And when I was still doing some part-time teaching in a college at the time, we had discussions about how we comply with the law, and not just the law, but just in general, how we make people safer. but it's clear that they did not have those discussions at Downing Street. And here's the thing. I can also get, if you're working in Downing Street and you're working for the people who have made the guidance and the law, and they're telling you it's all right to do this, that, and the other, then I can sort of understand people going, okay, well, that's, you know, we can do that then. That must be all right. Even if you think to yourself, it sounds a bit not all right. But yeah, she's basically said as far as she could tell, everyone was breaking the rule. Like, the rules have been broken every day, and therefore the implication is that everyone at some point would break the rules. But we also know from previous leaks of information that some of them knew they were breaking the rules because they were told, for example, about certain behaviours like social distancing. They said, make sure you social distance in these areas because that's where the CCTV cameras were. Right? So, and we know that from leaks. So we know that to an extent, a lot of them knew they were breaking the rules, which will have probably included her as well. And saying she would know she was the one who broke the law. Yeah, indeed. Loads of them. Well, all of them. I can't rule out the fact that there was one or two intelligent people who just shut themselves in their offices. But by and large, it sounds to me like they were all breaking the law. But again, remember, responsibility comes from the top. Boris Johnson was the boss in 10 Downing Street. But there we go. But yeah, it's worth having a read through. It's a long document, I will say that. But it's worth reading through just to understand the decision-making thought process of like the people at the top. And as I say, I've put a link in the description below. It's also useful for finding evidence on all sorts of things, loads of witness statements. I would say, if you plan on reading Dominic Cummings' witness statement, which is a long one, make sure you've got suitable fortification to get you through it. But we'll call it there. Thank you very much for coming, everyone. Don't forget to click the like button and subscribe, of course, and check out the description below for details of this, as also joining Patreon if you want to do that. Have a very good day, and try not to get blown away by the storm if you are affected. And until next time, I'll see you later.